Hi, good evening to all. Welcome back to the TCS Academy for Competition. So, dear aspirants, today in this session, I have brought a very important topic for all the competitive examinations, especially under the banking sector. Right? So, let's begin the session. So, in this session, we are going to discuss the Basel 2. In the previous video, we have discussed the Basel 1 and its norms, and today in this session, so I will take you through the Basel 2. So let's begin the session. Basel 2. Okay. Yeah. So before going to discuss in detail about the Basel norms, so today we have brought the very important topic, the Basel 2. So before going to jump into the topic called Basel 2, so let me give a brief account of Basel norms, right? Okay. What are Basel norms? Basel norms are set of agreements designed by BCBS, which provide recommendations to all the central banks in the world, so which are regulations to the central banks in regard to the banking risks, right? The Basel norms are set of agreements designed by the BCBS, okay, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, so which is making recommendations on the banking regulations, so that the banking regulations will be put before all the central banks of the world in regard to risks of the bank. Whenever the banks are exposed with several risks, it might be credit risk, operational risk, and market risk. So there will be chances of incurring loss by the banks. In order to withstand against the bankruptcy, the banker should have certain guidelines, right? So those guidelines which are designed by BCBS, and those guidelines which are put before the central banks of the world, central banks of the different foreign countries, and those central banks have to accept them. Okay, so if they accept, so they will be in turn giving the regulations to their commercial banks in the country, right? Therefore, the Basel norms are the set of agreements designed by BCBS, Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which provide recommendations on the banking regulations to the central banks in regard to the banking risks, right? Okay. The Basel Accord, the Basel agreements. So in that, till now, till date, the BCBS has designed the three important guidelines: Basel 1, and Basel 2, and Basel 3. So all these put together, all these collectively, we call it as Basel agreements or Basel norms. Okay. Let's straight away take up for the discussion the Basel 2. The Basel 2 has a three-pillar approach. Pillar 1, it is basically minimum capital requirement. The pillar 1, it is basically approached. The pillar 1 is basically talks about minimum capital requirement. The Basel 2, which talks about the supervisory review. The Basel 3, which talks about the market discipline, right? Okay. Now, so let's discuss the Basel 2, the Basel 2 norms, right? As far as pillars are concerned, I have told you the Basel 2 has 3-pillar approach. Pillar 1, which is considered as minimum capital requirement. Pillar 2, supervisory review. Pillar 3, market discipline. Okay, let's take up the pillar 1, which is basically talks about minimum capital requirement. Okay, as per the guidelines, as per the accord of the Basel 2, even the Basel 1, so which has fixed minimum capital must be kept as reserve, that should be 8%, right? 8% tier 1 capital. Tier 2 capital put together, tier 1 and tier 2 capital put together as per the Basel 1 accord, it must be 8%. But RBI has prescribed for its banking sector in India, it is 9%, right? Okay. So we have talked about the Basel 1 and Basel 2, the tier 1 and tier 2 capital. So in the previous video, okay. The Basel 2 has 2 types of capital. It has been suggested. One is Basel 2 has 2 types of capital. One is tier 1 capital and tier 2 capital. The tier 1 capital, it includes the equity capital, retained earnings and preference share capital. Tier 2 capital, which talks about the 3 important components. One is the short-term subordinated debts. Second, revaluation reserves, undisclosed reserves. Okay, so Basel 2 and Basel tier 1 and tier 2 put together. So as per the regulations of the Basel norms, it is 8%, but RBI has fixed at 9%. Is that clear? Okay. Let's move on to the pillar 2. The pillar 2 important guidelines, which talks about supervisory review of capital adequacy. Supervisory review of capital adequacy, right? So according to this, supervisory review of capital adequacy, it mainly focuses on bankers' internal processes and systems. Okay, so the pillar 2 of the Basel 2, which talks about mainly it focusing on the bank's internal processes and systems. It must be a supervisory review of capital adequacy. Okay, so whether the adequate capital the bankers have maintained or not, that has to be supervised time to time. For that, the pillar 2 talks about supervisory review of capital adequacy, which is fixed at 8% as per the Basel norm, right? Okay. Pillar 3, the aspect which talks about the market discipline and transparency. The banks must develop and use better risk management techniques in monitoring and managing all the 3 types of risks, which include credit risk, operational risk and market risk, right? The banks must develop and use the better risk management techniques in monitoring and managing all the 3 types of risks. So this is the important thing that talks about by the pillar 3. Then what is market discipline? Market discipline, there must be a mechanism that ensures disciplined banks and penalizes the weak management through primary and secondary market, right? Market discipline, there must be a mechanism, there must be a strategy that ensures disciplined banks. Disciplined banks. And penalizing if there are any weak management through primary and secondary market. Okay. So that is what we call market discipline has to be maintained across the commercial banks. Transparency. Transparency is simply talks about the disclosure of bank related information on timely basis to the public. So otherwise the public confidence will be lost. So therefore the transparency has to be maintained in the commercial banking system. Transparency is nothing but there is a disclosure bank related information on timely basis to the public. Okay. So Reserve Bank of India has implemented all these three norms, Basel 1 and Basel 2. Basel 2 norms which were completely accepted by the Reserve Bank of India, and thus Reserve Bank of India is implementing those Basel 2 guidelines across the commercial banks. Okay. So Basel 2 talks about the important thing, that is what we call a tier 1 capital. According to the Basel 2, tier 1 capital must be 4%, right? That means equity capital must be maintained. This is minimum capital requirement which comes under the tier 1 capital. Tier 1 capital, as I mentioned, it is a equity capital, right? It is equity capital. Equity capital must be 4% to withstand the financial risks. Okay. But Reserve Bank of India has fixed at 7%. Okay. Tier 1 capital must be 4% as per the Basel 2. But Reserve Bank of India has kept at 7%. So it is more secure against any financial risks, right? So both tier 1 and tier 2 capital. Okay. So equity capital, equity capital as per the Basel 2, it is at 2%, and RBI has fixed at 5.5%, right? Put together, total capital has to be maintained as a reserve, that is called minimum capital requirement. So that's at 8% as per the Basel 2, and the RBI has fixed at 9%. Is that clear? Okay. So this is all about the Basel 2. Thanks for listening. Have a nice day.